And yeah, I just want to reiterate that thank you, first of all, to Nathan for inviting me and then re-inviting me after 3 years. And it's so great to be here and encounter so many new interesting minds after all this time. So there are a few typos in the handout, but they're pretty obvious, so I don't think they'll be too confusing. And you have both translations as well as the original poetry that I'll be reading on the translations. I was going a little bit back and forth as to whether to read the translations or to read the original poems, and I decided in the end to read the original poems, but I'll try to do so a little bit slowly so that you have time to look over the English as well. I just didn't want to forgo the beauty of these poems. So my talk is about the stars and their constellations as figures of the imagination and the strategy for lyric enchantment in poetry written during the long 19th century. So, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Thus runs what is perhaps the most famous statement of Kant's practical philosophy, if not of his entire writings. I may be less than him in awe of the moral law, but he theorized it after all, becoming the lawgiver of the Germans and the modern Moses. However, I am fascinated by Kant's fascination with the stars. The words he uses are Bewunderung and Ehrfurcht. It is perhaps easy to see. They are the most distant objects we can perceive with our senses and the topic of our most far-reaching scientific endeavors. The observation of the stars, Kant writes, and I quote, begins from the place I occupy in the external world of sense and extends the connection in which I stand into an unbounded magnitude with worlds upon worlds and systems of systems, and moreover into the unbounded times of their periodic motion, their beginning, and their duration. End quote. The stars are also, of course, examples of the sublime, both of the dynamic sublime as virtually inexhaustible sources of light and heat, and of the mathematical sublime with respect to their sheer mass and size and their unfathomable plenitude in the night sky. This, however, requires a shift of perspective, and Kant writes, if someone calls the sight of the starry heavens sublime, he must not ground such a judging of it on concepts of worlds inhabited by rational beings, taking the bright points with which we see the space above us to be filled as their suns, about which they move in their purposively appointed orbits, but must take it as we see it, merely as a broad, all-embracing vault, and it must be merely under this representation that we posit the sublimity that a pure aesthetic judgment attributes to this object. In both cases, though, whether we regard the stars intellectually or aesthetically, we end up in the same place. For what amazes Kant about the stars is not any physical quality they possess, but the power of reason they are able to call forth. Kant writes, the first view of a countless multitude of worlds annihilates, as it were, my importance as an animal creature, whereas the moral law infinitely raises my worth as an intelligence. Similarly, and I quote, it is the disposition of the mind resulting from a certain representation, but not the object which is to be called sublime. This disposition of the mind is, as we know, none other than the moral feeling. One may object that it is only as also physical beings exposed to contingency and indifference that morality can be a purpose for us. Yet I am left with the impression of a tautology. I admire the stars and the moral law, and what I admire about the stars is the moral law. Nor are they, according to Kant, beautiful, as indeed a fiery flame is not for him a beauty. It is possible to argue that the stars as self-generating and self-sustaining entities are in some sense alive, perhaps even purposive, but they are not an instance of organic or spiritual life, failing thereby to exhibit the teleological structure requisite for the harmonious play of the faculties, the imagination and the understanding, which characterizes our experience of the beautiful. The only way the stars could be considered beautiful is by a prior act of the imagination, not as beauties of nature, and also not as products of an individual artistic talent, but as the result of the collective genius of mankind, that is, as constellations. However, that would implicate them not in the pursuits of modern science, but in one of the most primitive, yet also most persistent forms of superstition. And here Kant issues a stern warning, and I quote, "Consideration of the world began from the noblest spectacle that can ever be presented to the human senses and that our understanding can bear to follow in its broad extent, and ended in astrology." It would be silly to presume that therefore Kant is against the use of stellar images as symbols in poetry, but the interdiction against an illicit animation of the skies is certainly felt by the poets writing in his wake, most famously by Schiller in his Götter Griechenlands, the foundational document of modern disenchantment as a narrative of cultural and spiritual decline. Here, every celestial body is bound to laws of necessity, divested of its imaginative content, yet somehow still supplying the impetus for the poem in question. Full of mourning and nostalgia for the ideal world of the Greeks, he goes through them one by one, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And this is on your handout. Wo jetzt nur, wie unsere Weisen sagen, seelenlos ein Feuerball sich dreht, lenkte damals seinen goldenen Wagen Helios in stiller Majestät. And a bit further down. Morgen wieder neu sich zu entbinden, wühlt sie heute sich ihr eigenes Grab, und an ewig gleiche Spindel winden sich von selbst die Monde auf und ab. So what Schiller admonishes is nothing short of the very law of gravity that governs the movements of all objects in the sky. The modern concept of nature slavishly follows the Gesetz der Schwere, which weighs on the imagination and brings it down to earth, where emptiness similarly reigns. Traurig such ich an dem Sternenbogen, dich, Selene, find ich dort nicht mehr. Durch die Wälder ruf ich, durch die Wogen, ach, sie widerhallen leer. The stark contrast that Schiller sets up between ancient enchantment on the one hand and modern science and religion on the other is unfortunately static and blind to the enchantments inherent in astronomy itself, a dead end out of which it will take a poetic imagination of a different caliber to lead us. Another avid reader of Kant and admirer of Schiller, Hölderlin upends their opposing views of the sky. If for Kant the highest aspiration of human inquiry into the physical world must be safeguarded against the ruse of astrology, and for Schiller conversely it is astronomy that has set us on the path of irreversible disenchantment, Hölderlin is less careful to distinguish between the stellar disciplines. Writing to a friend while still at school, the 21-year-old poet supplies a status update. So this is from a letter which unfortunately is not on your handout, but I'll read it in English. I will soon have finished my hymn to humanity. But then again, it is a work of the lucid intervals, and they are far short of being a clear sky. Otherwise, I haven't done much, learned a few things about the rights of man from the great Jean-Jacques, and on clear nights fed my eyes on Orion and Sirius and the twin gods Castor and Pollux, that's all. Seriously, I am annoyed with myself for not having woken up to astronomy sooner. This winter I intend to devote myself to it in earnest. Here, Hölderlin already hints at a more intricate understanding of our position vis-à-vis the stars. The hymn on which he writes begins, and this is on your handout, Die ernste Stunde hat geschlagen, mein Herz gebeut, erkoren ist die Bahn. Die Wolke fleucht und neue Sterne tagen, und Hesperiden-Wonne lacht mich an. In these lines, the night has its own day, displaying the Hesperides, an ancient asterism no longer present on our star maps. The new stars notwithstanding, it soon becomes clear that at stake is not an addition or reappearance in the evening sky, but another comprehension of what is already there. Schon lernen wir das Band der Sterne, der Liebe Stimme männlicher verstehen. Wir reichen uns die Bruderrechte gerne, mit Heereskraft der Geisterbahn zu gehen. What does it mean to view the stars in a more manly way? In Hölderlin's 18th century vocabulary, it is something demanding of courage. But what is a courageous way of approaching the stars? They are still here regarded as spirits, unless the spirits are us, following in their paths. A few years later, Kant would be, as Hölderlin writes, virtually the only thing he reads. To another friend, Hegel, he clarifies that his sole occupations are Kant and the Greeks. And indeed, it is safe to say that his relationship to the starry heavens above is as Greek as it is Kantian. Yet although he frequently seems to join in Schiller's laments, a careful reading reveals, as I have already indicated, a much more complex interplay between the vagaries of the poetic imagination and the demands of modern science. In Die Wanderung, famous poem, the Greek constellations are a ubiquitous reminder of the ancient world and its absence. And this is not on your handout, so I'll read it in 2 languages. Unter den Sternen gedenk ich, o Ionia, dein, doch Menschen ist gegenwärtiges Lieb. So under the stars, O Ionia, I think of you, but people love what is present. Asterisms are an apparently ineradicable trace of mythically enchanted times, but they can just as well, from another perspective, be seen as a sign of the divine's unhappy transposition from our world to a transcendent realm. Such is the experience of Hyperion, who in a draft for Hölderlin's eponymous novel reminisces about his youth. So Hölderlin writes, and Hyperion, the main character, says, often when the stars appeared above me, I said their names, the names of the heroes who once lived on earth. Have pity on me, divine beings, I shouted. Let me forget who you were, or kill me with your splendor, you blessed youths. Perhaps more often than not, Hölderlin's stars disenchant. The constellations may have mythological names, but this very act of naming, measuring, and counting is already a way of keeping the heavenly powers at bay, of making them subservient. As the ode Dichterberuf has it on your handout, zu lang ist alles Göttliche dienstbar schon und alle Himmelskräfte verscherzt, verbraucht, die Gütigen zur Lust, danklos sein schlaues Geschlecht und zu kennen wähnt es, wenn ihnen der Erhabene den Acker baut, das Tagslicht und den Donnerer, und es spät das Seerohr, wohl sie all und zählt und nennet mit Namen des Himmels Sterne. Here it appears as though a technological invention, the telescope, is responsible for a deceptively intimate observation of the sky that unthankfully ignores the divine powers really at work in heavenly phenomena. But in fact, the story goes back much further, unveiling a dynamic inherent in our culture rather than a chronological development. In Hölderlin, every image of disenchantment is ultimately mythologically grounded. A great example is Chiron, perhaps out of all his poems the most intricately wrought with classical myth. So Chiron, poem's namesake, oldest and foremost among the centaurs in intelligence and learning, skilled in astronomy no less than in poetry, is already partaking of a sobering, objectifying activity. In his own voice, bei der Sterne Kühle lernt ich, aber das Nennbare nur. So in the cool of the stars I learned, but only the nameable. The naming of the stars is here conceived as a demystifying and disenchanting activity, but for a mythic creature like Chiron, there is of course no sharp line between astronomy and astrology, and the names of the stars were taken from myth. Indeed, the constellation Centaurus was named in honor of Chiron himself. In the next stanza, disenchantment is the work of the no less mythical hero Heracles. Das wilde Feld entzaubernd, das Traurige zog der Halbgott Zeus Knecht ein, der gerade Mann. So disenchanting that wild, sad, open meadow, the demigod Sue's servant came, the straight man. And Michael Hamburger here translates feld as open meadow, but I think it more likely refers to the field of stars just mentioned. Conversely, however, a modern man of science is able to spur on the imagination and transport it to hitherto inaccessible regions of space. One more thing is of interest in Hölderlin's poem, Chiron, which I probably should have put on the handout, but it's very long. Apostrophizing the sun, Chiron exclaims, Örtlich, Irrstern des Tages, erscheinest du, du auch, O Erde. So fixed in place you appear, wandering star of the day, you too, O Earth. This is highly perplexing. Living in a pre-Copernican age, it would make sense for Chiron to think of the sun as a wandering star of the day. But why say then that it appears in its place? And why does the Earth merely seem motionless? Alexander Hornold has suggested a solution to this problem. Over the course of the 18th century, it eventually becomes known in a post-Copernican twist that the stars, just like the planets, move. As Kant writes in his Universal History and Theory of the Heavens, and I quote him, Mr. Wright from Durham first gave me the occasion to consider the fixed stars not as a scattered teeming mass without perceptible order, but as one system with the closest similarity to a planetary system. I have found it very probable that the so-called fixed or firm stars could really be slowly moving, wandering stars of a higher order. This would explain why the sun just seems to be fixed in place, and how, even from a Copernican point of view, the planets move more than they seem to. No longer revolving around the self-same point in space, the Earth moves with an object that itself travels through the galaxies in turn moving through the universe. Thus, it is another scientific observation that here serves to counter the post-Copernican stasis of heavenly objects and thereby reanimate the skies afresh for the imaginative exploits of poetry. When we are no longer at a safe distance from which we may name them conveniently and put them to use, the stars become, in a different way from before, alive. The earliest and most unambiguous indication of Hölderlin's positive investment in modern astronomy, though, is his 1789 celebration of fellow Swabian Johannes Kepler, the first lines of which are on your handout, and I'll read them. Unter den Sternen ergeht sich mein Geist, die Gefilde des Uranus, überhin schwebt und sinnt, einsam ist und gewagt, ihren Tritt heischet die Bahn. Kepler's discoveries have not relocated the divine to the cold of the stars, but brought us to them. Insofar as the gods have escaped there, we have to accompany them on their stellar journey. From an earthly perspective, however, the stars remain unmoving and indeed at times dead, whether viewed from Germany or from France. So fast forward half a century to Nerval's El Desdichado, which is on your on your handout, another unrelenting bemoaning of helpless disenchantment that begins, Je suis le ténébreux, le veuf, l'inconsolé, le prince d'Aquitaine à la tour abolie, ma seule étoile est morte et mon lit constellé porte le soleil noir de la mélancolie. More than just a document of post-revolutionary malaise or personal illness, which is how Julia Kristeva famously treats it, I would argue that this poem exhibits the situation of lyric poetry once its theological or metaphysical underpinnings are no longer to be taken for granted. God is the sun, as the narrator's uncle tells him in Aurelia, Nerval's short novel, and the sun is dead. However, a curious detail about the poem is that although Nerval's lute mirrors the dead sky, the constellations are here an aspect of the star-studded instrument of poetry itself. After the collapse of conventional religion, it now becomes an imperative for the lyric to create its own heaven. Marked by melancholia, the vehicle of poetic enchantment nonetheless harbors the promise of a meaningful celestial structure in the shadow of the black sun. So, for Baudelaire, another restless stargazer, the one antidote to otherwise all-encompassing ennui is the poetic imagination. Much as to Mallarmé and Rilke, whom I will address in a minute, religion to Baudelaire is a kind of supreme fiction. It breathes the air of the imagination, but it is not, at least not anymore, governed by it. Yet all is not lost. Ah, he exclaims, Baudelaire that is, in his essay on Hugo. In spite of Newton and in spite of Laplace, astronomic certitude is not, even today, so great that reverie cannot lodge itself amid the vast lacunae still not explored by modern science. End quote. Given his avowed taste for things that are not of the earth, des choses qui ne sont pas de la terre, then it is perhaps surprising that Baudelaire takes no great interest in asterisms. To be sure, outer space is not off limits, and I'm quoting Baudelaire again, does it not also assume quite naturally its place among the immense domains of poetry? And he goes on, germinations, blossomings, flourishings, eruptions that are successive, simultaneous, slow or sudden, progressive or total, of stars, of planets, of suns, of constellations, are they simply God's forms of life, or habitations prepared by his goodness or justice for souls that he wishes to educate or progressively bring closer to him? And here's the question if Baudelaire is really speaking in his own voice here, as it were. The spectacles of the vast material universe are here hypothetically supplied to us by a benevolent God as fruits for our imagination. It is worth noting, however, that the last objects in Baudelaire's list, constellations, are different from the others in that they do not exist at all without imaginative intervention. Still, despite serving as an excellent example of the conjectural activity Baudelaire associates with the imagination, they play a relatively minor role in his poetry. Perhaps they are not adequately modern, not new, or it may simply be that the sky low and heavy weighs like a lid on the groaning mind prey to endless ennui, as the fourth and final spleen poem has it in Nathan Brown's translation. Yet it is not that the sky is therefore empty in Baudelaire. On the contrary, Le Couvercle calls it a plafond illuminé par une opéra bouffe, où chaque histrion foule un sol ensanglanté. So a ceiling illuminated by a comic opera, he calls the sky, where every showman treads on bloody soil. These sorry performers could be viewed as those who have aimed hubristically for the stars or an afterlife of some kind, but they can just as well be seen as the modern fate of the constellations, reduced to comic figures with a sometimes violent end, like Cassiopeia tied to a stellar torture device for sacrificing her daughter Andromeda, who received for her ordeal not just a constellation, but an entire galaxy. In any case, the skies in Baudelaire, whether living or dead, are crowded, and if they are to serve once more as the medium of a living imagination, they have first to be cleared. This is the desire of Obsession, the poem immediately following Le Fleur de Mal's spleen sequence. But as it turns out, emptying the night sky is no easy matter. And here I see no alternative but to quote the famous tercets, which are on your handout. Comme tu me plairais, ô nuit, sans ces étoiles, dont la lumière parle un langue connue, car je cherche le vide et le noir et le nu. Mais les ténèbres sont elles-mêmes d'étoiles, où vivent, jaillissant de mon œil par milliers, des êtres disparus au regard familier. So I cannot aspire to add anything to what has already been said about these stanzas, recently analyzed with exceptional acumen by Nathan. However, they do seem to me to form part of a larger narrative in which the sky is first divested and then reinvested with meaning. For Baudelaire, and as Gaston Bachelard will later emphasize, the imagination decomposes as much as it composes. This is the lesson, perhaps, of In Charogne, where the star of the poet's eyes is subject to become a pile of filth. Not just that we can find beauty in the most gruesome circumstances, but that the imagination must destroy in order to create, ceaselessly dissolving to leave room for novelty. In Obsession, the histrions of Le Couvercle show their familiar faces, preventing access to nothingness. And here Nathan's alternative readings of Toile as webs or draperies is illuminating. Draperies connect this poem to the curtains of the opera stage at which the sky is figured in Le Couvercle, while webs are indeed what a star map filled with constellations appears. Just as the void, in Nathan's words, infects the ideal at its very core, so the ideal is in a sense internal to the void. Baudelaire's example is chosen to illustrate this point. Even that which is most distant and utterly indifferent to us cannot help but take on, in the lyric, if not meaning, then at least a certain animated enchantment. The stars are as close as we come to static, chaotic indifference, but look carefully enough and they too start to move. In this sense, Mallarmé writes in his essay on ballet at once of the, quote, ideal dance of the constellations and the haughty lack of signification that shines in the alphabet of the night. It matters here that the stars do not initially take on the shapes of images or words. They are not, as in Baudelaire, familiar faces, and they do not speak any known language. They are merely letters in a yet-to-be-activated script, waiting to be used by a poetic imagination such as Mallarmé's. Indeed, there is perhaps no other poet for whom the phenomenon of the constellation assumes a similarly paramount importance, if only for its ambiguous yet decisive appearance in the monumental coup de dé, throw of the dice. The word constellation appears in all of Mallarmé's poetry only here and only once. He remarks, I believe one shouldn't often disturb the stars without good reasons or meditative gravity. But he has a tendency to sneak them in, as it were, surreptitiously, most notably in the modestly titled Several Sonnets, or Plusieurs Sonnets, that are among the most enigmatic and most beautiful of Mallarmé's lyrics, where a constellation, without explicitly being mentioned, appears in all but one. In the first two poems of the quartet, it has not yet the positive connotation it will later receive. Recalling Baudelaire's question whether the constellations are simply God's forms of life or habitations prepared by him for our edification, Mallarmé answers the former and takes it a step further, imagining a sadistic God twisting the bands of stars until they die. And this is on your handout. Luxe aux salles d'ébène où pour séduire un roi se tordent dans leur mort des guirlandes célèbres. Vous n'êtes qu'un orgueil menti par les ténèbres, aux yeux solitaires éblouis de sa foi. The constellations are here among those glorious lies by which the spectacle of matter is transformed into divine impressions that Mallarmé mentions in a famous letter, but they are not a properly poetic one as is constructed in Coup de Dé. In fact, they fade in comparison with an earthly glow that the genius of mankind emits into boring space. And here's the concluding stanza. L'espace à soi pareil qu'il s'accroisse ou se nie, roule dans cette nuit des feux vils pour témoin que c'est d'un astre en fait allumé le chenille. As in Obsession and in a more hopeful register, a poem by Rilke that I will soon reach, it is not we who observe the stars, but the stars that observe us. The stars are here vile, but not exactly useless. They bear witness to the fact that there is brightness also on earth. In the following sonnet, however, the constellation is exactly that, useless, inutile, The time of day has changed from dusk to night to dawn, and then turns apparently to day and night again over the course of these sonnets. And we are here faced in the second poem with a forlorn swan stuck in an icy winter lake. Whether or not it will eventually break free from the grip of the ice, it is criticized, and I'm quoting Mallarmé, for never having sung of a land in which to exist, pour n'avoir pas chanté la région où vivre, having shouted at the sky, perhaps, instead of praising the earth. The punishment is exile. And here I'm quoting Mallarmé again, it's on your handout. Tout son col secouera cette blanche agonie, par l'espace infligé à l'oiseau qui le nie. Mais non l'horreur du sol où le plumage est pris. Fantôme qu'à ce lieu, son pur éclat d'assigne, il s'immobilise au songe froid de mépris, que va parmi l'exil inutile le signe. One reason that the swan's transfiguration into the swan, capital S, the constellation that is useless, may be that it is again nothing new. Being among the original Ptolemaic constellations, it is hardly the product of a now active imagination. The same could be said of the septuor, or septet, that features in the final poem of the sequence, the much discussed sonnet onyx, or sonnet allégorique de soi-même. Nevertheless, it assumes an entirely different significance. Summing up the poem's semantic content, Mallarmé writes, and I think this will be helpful, there is a window open at night, the two shutters fastened, a room with no one in it, despite the stable appearance provided by the fastened shutters, and in a night made of absence and questioning, with no furniture apart from the vague outline of what appears to be tables, a warlike and dying frame of a mirror hung up at the back of the room, with its reflection, a stellar and incomprehensible reflection of Arsa Meyer, which links to heaven alone, this dwelling abandoned by the world. And it's kind of funny that his prosaic paraphrase, his explication of this poem is still kind of dizzying in a way. But needless to say, the poem itself harbors much greater complexity. And I thought I'd read it if I'm not doing too poorly on time. How's it going? Yeah, so I'll read the poem, although, you know, it's fine if you don't completely grasp the full significance of it, because I'm just going to comment on a few points, but I'll read it anyway. Ces purs ongles très hauts dédiant leur onyx, l'angoisse minuit soutient lampadophore, main rêve vespéral brûlé par le phénix, que ne recueille pas de cinéraire amphore. Sur les crédences au salon vide, nul ptix, aboli bibelot d'inanité sonore, car le maître est allé puiser des pleurs au styx, avec ce seul objet dans le néant sonore. Mais proche la croisée au nord vacante, au nord, agonise selon peut-être le décor des licornes rouant du feu contre une nyx. Elle, défunte, nue en le miroir encore, que dans l'oubli fermé par le cadre se fixe, de scintillation sitôt le septuor. Far from attempting a full commentary, I just want to give a remark or two on the constellation and its phenomenological structure here. As in the Swan poem, it appears not until the very end, where it takes on the force of an event that retroactively injects itself into the stanzas prior. Thus, if the septet in the final line is Arsa Meyer, it is simultaneously more than that. Before the Big Dipper, the stars were silky black nails. Before the Great Bear, they were a nymph chased by fiery unicorns. The stars supply the only light the poem knows, yet the imagination is a step ahead of their conventional significance. The asterism here is at once very familiar, the Big Dipper being arguably the most recognizable pattern in the night sky, and utterly mysterious, incomprehensible, as Mallarmé puts it in his own paraphrase. The use of a traditional grouping of stars indicates that we are dealing here with our world, the real one, and not a fantasy hallucinated in the poem, while the sublime overload of images divests the constellation of any previous meaningful articulation. What sets the poem into motion is anguish, an anxiety concerning old dreams of religious redemption, still somewhat upheld by the phoenix. Paradoxically, it is the return of a stellar order at the end of the poem, which through its own intricate ordering ensures its necessity, that affords the hope of an aesthetic redemption of the world where the poetic imagination is enough. Yet this is only possible due to an imaginative disarticulation of an ancient aspiration to find ready-made order in the world that hints at a way out of it. By contrast, Mallarmé presents the process of meaning-making as a laborious yet playful activity that incorporates the drama of enchantment and disenchantment. As Joshua Landy puts it in his analysis, and I quote him, "A constellation is an ordering that tacitly admits its own arbitrariness, and it is precisely thereby believable." We might even say with Mallarmé that it is a question not just of imagining, but of lying a world of beauty into being, with the caveat that his poetry is unusually explicit in doing so. The septet that ends the Sonnet Onyx recurs illustriously in Coup de Dé, which Jean-Pierre Richard calls Mallarmé's clearest work, in any case the most explicit. And I always thought this was a little funny, because one could just as well call it the most enigmatic. But it does contain something rare in Mallarmé, though common in the lyric at large, that is brief gnomic statements of a prophetic quality, the most famous of which, aside from the title, being "Nothing will have taken place but the place, except perhaps a constellation." In his masterful reading, Quentin Meillassoux makes much of this peut-être. Without going into the numerological niceties of his interpretation, I will simply concur on the epochal significance of this word. On it, for Mallarmé, rests the entire possibility of poetry in a disenchanted environment. At first, the valuation of the constellation remains ambivalent in Coup de Dé, as it enters into rivalry with the powers of the poetic imagination. Here, the white and black of the written page is confronted with the black and white of the night sky. And here I'm quoting Mallarmé from your handout. Plume solitaire est partie, sauf que la rencontre où les fleurs, une toque de minuit, et immobilise au velours chiffonné par un esclavement sombre, cette blancheur rigide, dérisoire en opposition au ciel, trop pour ne pas marquer exiguement quiconque prenne sa main de l'écueil. Son coiffe comme de l'héroïque, irrésistible mais contenue par sa petite raison virile en foudre. Although the heavens here appear to have the upper hand, the bitter prince that is anyone defiantly raises the poet's pen toward the crumpled velvet of space. It would sound trite to say that the rest of the poem aims to sublate this opposition between the creative imagination and the resistance of the material universe, between the wet depths of the earth and the stellar beyond. However, that is indeed the weight of the wager. As if it would be, except perhaps, the constellation so far away, Mallarmé writes, that a place fuses with the beyond, is attached to so many qualifications, for it holds a singular promise, not just of man-made order imposed on an unruly universe, but that such ordering, undertaken seriously, will suffice. And here I switch to Rilke, because it is in this spirit that Rilke writes in a sonnet to Orpheus, also on your handout, auch die sternische Verbindung trügt, doch uns freue eine Weile nun, der Figur zu glauben. Das genügt. Paul de Man, in his reading, takes this statement as an insuperable and intolerable disenchantment. For him, it reduces the implied totality to a mere illusion of the senses. But the force of Rilke's affirmation is exactly the opposite. There is no totality implied here or elsewhere by his asterisms. So what is it then that Rilke claims to be enough? What does it mean to believe in the constellation for a while? If I claim to believe in the figure that the constellation traces, do I mean to say it really does depict this figure? Well, insofar as it is a constellation at all, it does depict a figure. One may be led to think then that Rilke spurs us to indulge momentarily in the belief that stars are not arranged into significant groups by man, but by some supersensible being who has thereby invested them with transcendent meaning. Fortunately, Rilke suggests nothing of the kind. He merely asks us to believe in the constellation itself, making no claims about its origin. It is implied, nonetheless, by the inclusion here and in the Duino elegies of apparently non-existent asterisms. The sonnet that elicited such despondency in de Man begins, "Sieh den Himmel, heißt kein Sternbild Reiter?" And no, there is no constellation called rider or horseman, just as there is none called staff, wreath of fruit, cradle, path, the burning book, doll, or window, as the 10th and final Duino elegy would have us believe. Or is there? Whoever consults a star map is bound to be disappointed, searching in vain among the 88 constellations recognized by the International Astronomical Union. Still, I would argue, Rilke refers to our sky, and he is not imagining the sudden appearance of additional stars, which would make of his poem a piece of fantastic fiction. Rather, the imperative is to be taken seriously. Look at the sky. Is there no constellation named Rider? If not, let us look again. Perhaps we have missed it. Valéry writes of his initial encountering coup d'idée. It was as though a new asterism had proffered itself in the heavens, as if a constellation had at last assumed its meaning. As if, again, nothing will have taken place but the place, except perhaps a constellation. There are no guarantees, and there may be countless moments when belief in our capacity to make meaning is impossible to sustain. When the constellation works, however, it denotes not just an alignment with a pre-existing structure of the world, but its surpassing. In another sonnet to Orpheus, echoing Mallarmé's ideal dance of the constellations, Rilke addresses the deceased girl for whom it was written, and this is also on your handout. O komm und geh, du fast noch Kind, ergänze für einen Augenblick die Tanzfigur, zum reinen Sternbild einer jener Tänze, darin wird die dumpf ordnende Natur vergänglich übertreffen. Compared to the natural laws that govern the positions of heavenly bodies, we are indeed ephemeral, and our endeavors just for a moment. But out of the indifferent dispersion of matter in space, we form repositories of meaning. If this is all we are asked to believe, one may question in what way the constellation deceives, as Rilke has it. If asterisms admit their own arbitrariness and their dependence on our imagination, that would seem to undermine their deception. Yet even so, they trick us in important ways. For one, our constellations appear only from an earthly point of view. Stars forming figures do not exist on a plane or concave surface, but are rather light years apart in all directions, making their relative as well as their absolute distance impossible to perceive without advanced knowledge and equipment. What's more, they may not exist at all, having burnt out a long time ago, their light only now reaching us. Thus, the universe may prove less hospitable to our impositions of meaning than we had imagined, their efficacy more dependent on our own limited perspectives. Rilke does not fail to take this into account. Fulfilling poetically the Copernican revolution, he places us in the heavens of extraterrestrial poets. This is also on your handout. Vielleicht sind wir oben, in Himmel andere Wesen eingewoben, die zu uns aufschauen abends. Vielleicht loben uns ihre Dichter. Vielleicht beten viele zu uns empor. Vielleicht sind wir die Ziele von fremden Flüchen, die uns nie erreichen, Nachbarn eines Gottes, den sie meinen, in unsere Höhe, wenn sie einsam weinen, an den sie glauben und den sie verlieren, und dessen Bildnis wie ein Schein aus ihren suchenden Lampen, flüchtig und verweht, über unsere zerstreuten Gesichter geht. With a string of maybes, this early poem from the Book of Images effectively relativizes or reverses transcendence itself. What counts as heaven is just a matter of physical location within the universe. So I approach the end of my talk. The stars and their constellations have, of course, only served as a pretext for discussing the workings of the poetic imagination. But they are an exemplary example, a figure of figuration, a symbol of symbolism. Curiously, the story of the stars in 19th century poetry is not overall one of disenchantment. One could speak of a movement of re-enchantment were it not for the fact that they were never entirely disenchanted and the profound kinship between the old and the new that all of the poets I've discussed emphasize. If it has any measure of truth that, as Benjamin writes, the stars in Baudelaire represent a picture puzzle of the commodity, the ever-same in great masses, it is definitely not true in general. In fact, they are among the few things visible to the naked eye that are not yet for sale. Nor are they in any sense the same. They all have different sizes, colors, and intensity. They are born and they die, and the figures they make up are in each case unique, yet in theory at least subject to change. The constellations, ancient as they are and of unknown authorship, are the product of one observation at one time. Were we to forget them, they would never appear to us again in the shape of the gods and animals as which they have been interpreted. They thereby confront the certainty of rhythmic repetition and the prophecies drawn from it with the contingencies of cultural history and the moment of poetic imagination. They are like fireworks frozen in time, instantaneous, singular, and unrepeatable, all the while being permanent and eternal. On the other hand, a constellation cannot be created on the whim of an individual, since they draw their power from ancient myth that is increasingly obsolete. It requires a more impersonal mind and at least a degree of collective recognition. Mallarmé's notorious effacement of self, where he fancies himself but a capacity possessed by the spiritual universe to see itself and develop itself, is not just a humble brag, but a consequence of this. The question is whether through such efforts modernity shall succeed in becoming for us another antiquity, and not as merely antiquated, but as a foundation for secular myth. It is not a matter, in my view, of whether we are enchanted. I align myself with those scholars who contend that we have never, in fact, been totally disenchanted. However, that does not mean that our enchantments are unchanging. It is a matter of the quality as opposed to the mere quantity of our enchantments. The question then becomes, again, whether poetry can create for us a better lie in which to live, worthier, more sophisticated, newer, more beautiful, living up to the demands of the imagination. I prefer to speak of lies here rather than fictions, because in spite of their negative connotation and despite their frequent conflation by poets themselves, I do not believe the lyric is fundamentally fictional. This is, of course, a subject of much debate into which I have entered elsewhere, and there is no sure way of telling whether a specific poem is factual, fictional, or inventively mendacious. What I wish to highlight is simply that the imagination is not just a faculty for creating fictions. The fictionalization of poetic imagination is rather a disenchanting maneuver which allows us not to take it seriously. Baudelaire, therefore, is careful to distinguish the imagination from mere fantasy. Whereas fantasy is fiction, counterfactually presenting the world as it is not, The imagination is the very creator of the world, not just of fictional worlds, but the actual world we inhabit. It is the very opposite of a faculty for creating fictions and that which makes the real world real. This may seem at odds with his notion that poetry is that which is most real, that which is only true in another world. Yet, as I am hardly the first to point out, this other world is neither a fictional world nor a transcendent world inaccessible to us, or an afterlife, but indeed our world seen from the point of view of its becoming. This happens not through fabulation, but through the imagination's tendency to make correspondences, analogies, and conjectures. Such is the meaning of correspondance, as I am also not the first to observe. There are no correspondences unless we make them. The task of the poet, and one might add here of the lyric poet in particular, is therefore to translate in a magnificent language, and I'm quoting Baudelaire, different from prose and music, the eternal conjectures of human curiosity. They are patterns that do not actually exist in the external world, but also do not exist in our minds before being confronted with it. In this sense, beauty for Baudelaire is always a kind of lie, as it is inaccessible to perception alone. And while there are mere facts and things, these do not add up to a world in which to live, but only monotonous ennui. I'm really close to finishing, sorry. In a remark on landscape painting, Baudelaire calls those artists who do not respect this liars, and at the same time he rehabilitates the lie as indispensable for artistic practice. And I'm quoting him, "The majority of our landscape artists are liars, precisely because they have neglected to lie. In order to arrive at the real world, the artist has to lie in a vulgar sense, precisely in order to avoid a lie that is for Baudelaire a principal error, the idea that true reality is one of brute impressions unclouded by the imagination." Although the philosopher would never put it in this way, the Baudelarian concept of beauty is perhaps not so different from the Kantian one, which involves the intimation of purpose that requires the free play of the imagination and is not without it. Kant writes, "The imagination as a productive cognitive faculty is namely very powerful in creating, as it were, another nature out of the material the real one gives it." For Baudelaire, however, it is this second nature that is most real. Yet it is not simply handed to us by the imagination, but a matter of ceaseless working and unworking. Traditionally, the imagination is thought as the faculty for forming images. In the words of Bachelard, though, it is, quote, rather the faculty of deforming images provided by perception. It is above all the faculty of liberating us from first images, of changing images. Nonetheless, I would take issue with the statement that imagination is never wrong, since imagination does not have to confront an image with objective reality. On the contrary, it unceasingly confronts a reality on which it implicitly puts value, not just of this or that which is being imagined, but this or that as a medium for creating value. It values the process of creating values. That it can be wrong from one perspective and right from another is part of what makes it exciting, and I know of no better instance of this than the constellations. Whether they will continue to capture the interest of poets is an open question. The space age long over, it is perhaps not the light pollution of an ever-increasing number of satellites that will inspire our imagination, but once more the stars and their promise of a fresh deception. Thank you.